Hello, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Obviously, I'd love to have done a proper physical event at one of our favourite venues somewhere, but I think this event is as good as we can make it, given the situation. I'm Dave Haslam. Yes, I'm the author. I'm going to introduce people as we go through the evening tonight. The format is that I will introduce the book for 10 or 15 minutes. And then Miranda Sawyer will join us and ask me some questions. And then there will be an audience Q&A. However, interspersed in that format will be poems, Sylvia Plath poems, which will be read to us by Vicky Brazier. And we'll come to them in due course, and I'll introduce them. Can I just say that thank you, yes, to everyone who's registered and attending. There was an option to donate to the mental health charity Manchester Mind on the registration page, and lots of you did. And I think we've raised somewhere between about 170 and 200 pounds for that mental health charity this evening. So we're already doing something great together. Okay, so the book, I'm going to hold it up now. I'm going to hold the book at numerous intervals throughout the day, throughout the evening. It's called My Second Home, Sylvia Plath in Paris, 1956. It's part of a series of small format limited edition books that I've written, and all published by Confingo, vinyl collecting, Keith Haring, the artist, Courtney Love in Liverpool, 1982. I'm just going to briefly mention the Courtney Love book. Courtney Love came to Britain when she was 17, so way before she met Kurt Cobain and before Hole, and she lived in Liverpool for 3 months. Interesting parallels kind of made themselves known to me as I was writing the Plath book. 2 young American women arriving in Britain. Courtney talks about Liverpool being a transformative experience, the time she spent in Liverpool. I mean, what happened in Liverpool? On the face of it, not very much. I explain in this book, Courtney had a few drunk nights and 1 or 2 lovers and listened to a lot of music and read some books, but somehow that was enough to give Courtney Love the insight and the confidence to find the pathway to become the person she wanted to be, which in some ways is what happened to Sylvia Plath in Paris. Both of them, of course, arriving in Europe with a lot of, shall we say, chaos in their heads. Okay, so I first got interested in Sylvia Plath when I was 16, 42 years ago. I read Ariel at school. I still consider that to be the kind of the classic Ariel cover, very, very striking. And then I read The Bell Jar, As We Do. Similarly, I kind of think of that as the cover, but there are other editions, as we know. When I read Ariel poems, I was studying them at school. They made a very visceral impact, I think, on me. I didn't know the context of the poems. I didn't know much about Sylvia Plath's life or much about poetry even, but they still spoke very, very deeply and immediately, and as I say, viscerally to me. 1988, I made a short film for Granada TV about Sylvia Plath's gravestone in Hepton Stall. And for that, I obviously learned a little bit more about her life. But even knowing as much as I do about her life, it still, for me, actually makes the poems more impactful, not less. You know, they still amaze me. And Paris, I mean, Paris is a city that I've visited many times. I first went there more or less the same time as I discovered Sylvia Plath, I think, probably when I was 16 or 17, in fact, my first trip abroad was to Paris on the ferry. I've done some great DJ gigs there, and I've been lucky enough to live there for relatively extended periods over the last few years. So Plath and her poetry, Paris, the city. I think all this material has been in my head since I was 16, ready to be unlocked. So although it's only a small book, I like to tell people it took me 42 years to write. Anyway, so 1956 was the year that Sylvia Plath married Ted Hughes, but at the beginning of the year, she was in Paris with a man called Richard Sassoon, Richard Sassoon was a boyfriend that she'd been seeing for 2 or 3 years. He was living in Paris at the time. Plath had come to Cambridge, as you know, October the 1st, 1955, with her Samsonite luggage. And on her first holiday, she went over to Paris to meet Richard. She'd always dreamt about Paris. She had an imagined Paris in her head, Paris of that she'd kind of understood and appreciated and imagined via films, paintings, the works of Henry James, Paul Verlaine, and so on. And Christmas with Richard absolutely lived up to her expectations. She and he, they both spent Christmas Day at Notre Dame Cathedral. However, just before she left the city, Richard told her he wanted to break up with her. Okay, so Easter comes along, that's her next big holiday from Cambridge, and she decides to go back to Paris and see Richard again. Now, Richard had told her, first of all, he wanted to break up with her, and secondly, that at Easter he was going to go to Spain. But she didn't believe him or didn't want to believe him, and she decided that she'd go to Paris, knock on his door, and rekindle their romance. About a month before Easter 1956, she met Ted Hughes at a party, a scenario I think many people know, and I talk a little bit about the book. That was the only time she'd met Ted Hughes up until the day before the trip to Paris. So they weren't dating, they just encountered each other. But Ted was really definitely in her head by that point. So when Plath gets to Paris at Easter, she goes to knock on Richard's door, and Richard has gone and he's avoiding her, and she realizes that she's got herself a holiday in Paris for 2 weeks on her own. And the book is particularly about Easter 1956. Easter, a time of suffering, but also redemption. She's in a hotel on her own in Notre Dame. Paris seems to, over those 2 weeks, give her the space to process a lot of stuff in her head. A lot of that chaos, the tangled love life, deeper things, even deeper things like the loss of her father, her ambition, her poetry. She was able to process all that, and her depression even. I have to do a big shout out to one particular person that she met in Paris, Giovanni. Giovanni, an Italian man who befriends her in Paris and takes her out for dinner on the first night, and again a few times, and listens to her talking about that love life and her ambition and her poetry, her favorite poetry. At the end of the 2 weeks, she decides to commit herself to Ted Hughes, and within 10 weeks, they're married. So it's like a sliding doors moment. What if Richard had been there when she knocked on his door? We'll never know. So I had lots of material to draw upon, her diaries, her journals. She wrote extensive journals while she was in Paris, but I wanted to explore other angles as well, less obvious ones. One of them was James Baldwin. Again, like I say, not an obvious angle when I'm writing about Sylvia Plath, but Baldwin, who's one of my favorite writers ever, was in Paris at the same time. He was living there on a much longer stay, but the weekend that Sylvia Plath arrived in Paris was the weekend that Baldwin was putting the final touches to his book, Giovanni's Room, one of the great novels ever in the English language. And I kind of wished that they'd met. If it was a work of fiction, James Baldwin and Sylvia Plath would have met in Saint-Germain in a cafe. But this is reality, and they didn't meet, but I kind of try and bring them together. In fact, I do bring them together in a manner of speaking at the end. The other angle I tried to explore, which maybe wasn't obvious, was to link Plath's experiences with a film, a small film, short film, a French film called Le Ballon Rouge, The Red Balloon, which was first shown at Cannes in 1956 at the Cannes Film Festival. And it was made in Menilmontant, filmed in Menilmontant in Paris. And so I make kind of a few connections between the book, Le Ballon Rouge, The Red Balloon, and of course it's one of the inspirations for Zoe's wonderful design on the front of the Confingo book. The other reason why it's that beautiful red color is because I discovered what Sylvia Plath's favorite lipstick is. And you might want to make a note of this. My friend Greg, particularly, her favorite lipstick was made by Revlon, and it's called Cherries in the Snow, and it's kind of that color. So the shadow of what happens to Sylvia Plath after 1956 and her tragic end, all that hangs over the story. Of course it does. But although we know the tragic end of her life, I think the end of that story isn't the whole story. And the thing about Plath in that Easter break was that although she was alone and sometimes lonely, there were also moments of happiness, moments of bliss, moments when her self-doubt and her trauma and her history seemed to fade away. And I describe those times. Some of them are kind of triggered by very simple things. And she says on a number of occasions that she's feeling elated. And I'm thinking, elated is not a word that I connect with Sylvia Plath. And yet that is sometimes how she felt in Paris. 10 weeks later, she marries Ted. They honeymoon that summer in Spain. On the way back from Spain, August 1956, she visits Paris for the third time. And with Ted, she's exuberant. And I can kind of imagine her dragging Ted around Paris to all her favorite places and trying not to let on that some of them were places that she'd taken a former lover. But he actually, I think, begins to understand that. So she's exuberant, but Ted Hughes's perception of that visit is in a poem called Your Paris, which is in Birthday Letters, his collection that came out many years after Plath's death. And his perception of Paris was very different, and it's a very revealing poem. And I talk about that quite a lot in the book. One occasion, she told her mother she wanted to live in Paris for a while with Ted and the family, but she never went back. After 1956 and those 3 visits, she never went back. Circumstances conspired against us. And I kind of feel bad on her behalf for this. It's like for her, Paris put the word if into the word life. You know, Paris was like, for her, about choices, opportunity, and potential. I'm going to read a little bit from the book. Okay, I've been talking for 15 minutes, so I'm only going to read a short bit. I'm going to read about when that crucial moment at the beginning of her visit to Paris, Easter, when she goes to see Richard. I have to say that the night before she arrives in Paris, she sees Ted for the second time. She stays over in his flat, or a flat on Rugby Street near the British Museum, the night before she arrives in Paris. Then the next day she gets the ferry and she's in Paris. And arriving in Paris, she was excited and too hungry and too impatient to sleep. She'd woken up in the shared house in Rugby Street with Ted Hughes. By twilight, Sylvia was in Paris. Once washed, she resolved to go and find 4 Rue de Vivier, where Richard was staying. However, she realized she'd lost her map of Paris during her journey over. Setting off, she encountered an Italian man who'd been using the telephone in the lobby of the hotel, and he offered to loan her his street map. Plath had no knowledge of Italian, and Giovanni knew no English, so they talked French. His was good, hers was enthusiastic but basic. She explained a little about herself, and Giovanni invited her to walk along Boulevard Saint-Germain and have dinner with him. They shared steak tartare and wine and meringue. Sylvia discovered he was the Paris correspondent for a communist journal based in Rome. Back at the hotel, having diverted from her mission to find Richard, she slept on her own. The next day, Palm Sunday, her first full day in Paris, she left the hotel and walked through Saint-Germain, along Rue Saint-Dominique and on to Rue de Vivier. For weeks, she'd been imagining herself in Paris, calmly, quietly confronting Richard. She was confident of a result. She wrote, "My will and my love can melt doors." But it was not to be. When Sylvia arrived at Richard's place, the concierge confirmed he had indeed gone to Spain. Sylvia asked the concierge for some paper so she could write to Richard. She cried and wrote. She wrote and wrote. On the radio, Nat King Cole was singing, "Smile, though your heart is aching." Sylvia couldn't smile. Her tears fell on the paper as she wrote to Richard. So, after all, it was over, and she'd be in Paris without him. He'd left no forwarding address. And to compound her distress, her letters begging him to return early from Spain to meet her were on the concierge's desk, unopened and unread. The concierge at 4 Rue de Vivier had a black poodle which nuzzled at Sylvia's legs as she wrote her distress notes to Richard. Maybe it seemed to her that the dog was the only living creature that cared about her pain, but it was enough. Sylvia dried her tears, patted the poodle, and took a wander through the fruit stalls of the Champ du Mas, an open green space overlooked by the Eiffel Tower. At a cafe close by, Sylvia ordered a plate of cold meat and a coffee, which was served in the traditional style, short and black, but Sylvia didn't like the bitter taste and ordered a coffee with milk. As she drank and ate, she read Jean Anouilh's play Antigone, one of her holiday reads, perhaps discovering these sentences that the young female protagonist says to King Creon. I will not be moderate. I will not be satisfied with a bit of cake you offer me if I promise to be a good little girl. The second coffee was more to her taste. She was thrilled by Antigone. I felt downright happy, she wrote in her journal. She describes how a calmness came over her that Sunday morning, an awakening. It's a beautiful moment. Plath's realization of liberation and belonging. She wrote, I had as much right to take my time eating, to look around, to wander and sit in the sun in Paris as anyone. Okay, so we're going to have the first poem. Vicky's going to read Mad Girl's Love Song. The poem was published in the summer of 1953 in Mademoiselle magazine. That was the New York magazine that Plath was working on in that summer. The experiences around all that is in the bell jar. It's said that Plath always really liked this poem, whereas Mr. Hughes downgraded it, even in the collected poems. So all the more reason for reading it tonight. Thank you, Vicky.
I shut my eyes and all the world drops dead. I lift my lids and all is born again. I think I made you up inside my head. The stars go waltzing out in blue and red and arbitrary blackness gallops in. I shut my eyes and all the world drops dead. I dreamt that you bewitched me into bed and sung me moonstruck, kissed me quite insane. I think I made you up inside my head. God topples from the sky, hell's fires fade, exit seraphim and Satan's men. I shut my eyes and all the world drops dead. I fancied you'd return the way you said. But I grow old and I forget your name. I think I made you up inside my head. I should have loved a thunderbird instead. At least when spring comes, they roar back again. I shut my eyes and all the world drops dead. I think I made you up inside my head.
That's brilliant, Vicky. Thank you so much. So I'd like to welcome Miranda Sawyer. Miranda, the broadcaster, writer and journalist. Hi, Miranda.
Hiya, all right.
Just to say that audience questions are welcome. Put them in the chat, and
in the Q&A.
We've spoken the Q&A. After the Q&A, we're going to have another poem from Vicky, and in that time, Miranda will collect some of the questions from the audience, and I'll answer as many as we can get through. So over to you, Miranda. You've read the book, I know that for sure.
I have all 4 here, look. Ta-da! Let's keep wafting them at everybody. Look at that, look how beautiful these are. Aren't they gorgeous? I suppose I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, you drew some parallels between Sylvia the Sylvia Plath book and the Courtney Love book, which I was interested in when I was reading it as well. And you could almost kind of draw a little bit of a parallel with the Keith Haring book as well, in that it's slightly about the relationship between a person, a young person, and a city that they really want to be in, and what that can do to them. And I'm interested in that. You write a really beautiful, at the beginning of the Plath book, I'm just going to read it out because I copied it out because it's so lovely. And this is what your analysis about kind of what Paris meant to Sylvia. This is what you wrote: like, a mythical place which promised light and delight and deep experiences. Maybe we all have such places in our minds where we, my writing's terrible, sorry. we can imagine uncaging ourselves and discovering the secret of life. And I'm really interested in that relationship, because I know that Paris has done that for you at certain points. Manchester has done that for you. You know, these places are important, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, somewhere where you can uncage yourself, and also that sometimes those places are and remain imaginary. You know, I mean, I remember, again, when I was 16, 17, I wanted to be in New York. I thought that that was the place where I belonged, and that I would find myself. I would be at CBGB's with Television and Blondie and Talking Heads, and you know, I kind of bump into Andy Warhol, and I didn't know, but I probably also bumped into Keith Haring. But I never made it. You know, I never got on the Freddie Laker flight and went to New York. But I think a lot of it is, not a lot of it, but some of it is what we project into those cities. You know, we see them as a place of escape. They don't really care about us. You know, I mean, I go to Paris a lot, but Paris doesn't, you know, the River Seine just keeps on flowing along. It's kind of what I take to the city. And
yeah, or how you imagine yourself within an environment, isn't it, somehow? Yeah,
it is. And I think just being somewhere different is important. But also, you know, they are, you know, for Courtney Love and Keith Haring and for Plath, the cities that they find that way to express themselves and the beginning of that pathway to be the person they wanted to be. You know, it's often to do also with the kind of the inspiration they take from it. But I think a lot of it is just because they're away. You know, I mean, Baldwin, I quote Baldwin saying, you know, that for young Americans, Paris is a place to embrace irresponsibility. Well, sometimes embracing irresponsibility leads you to find a part of you didn't know was there. You know, you kind of get rid of the chains that you might feel are keeping you at home, or, you know, and yeah, so maybe there's a chance that you find a slightly different you know, as Ultravox sang, you know, and anything goes where no one knows your name.
And also there's that kind of weird public-private element that I think you describe really well in this book, where Sylvia Plath is going out a lot, but by herself. So there's a kind of, she's out in the public environment of Paris and she bumps into Giovanni, and sometimes she expected to be meeting up with Richard. That's who she thought she was going to be spending the time with. That's out. So she bumps into Giovanni. She looks up old boyfriends. She makes friends with a funny Greek guy who called Dimitri.
But we never quite believe him. She doesn't believe him that he's called Dimitri.
No, I think maybe not. But these things are quite important encounters, I think, when you're young, because it's an idea that you do exist and you can, you know, not to get too existential about it, but you can do in Paris, that, you know, the reaction of other people gives you a sense of yourself.
Yeah, and also I think at that age you are quite porous, you know, which is a word that I think I used in one of the other books, in the sense that you are discovering your identity in yourself and you absorb things and ideas, and you're not kind of, you know, your ideas and your attitudes and your idea of self is not, you know, set in concrete. And, you know, I think some people absorb all that experience better or in a more transformational way than other people. And, you know, I think in terms of my experience in Paris, which is not the subject of any of those books, but I think that what I found was that I was actually able to rediscover that porousness, even though when I started living there, I was 55. That was actually an important part of the experience, you know? And so Sylvia kind of arrives in Paris wanting to embrace the city. That's the attitude. Same with Keith Haring in New York, you know, same with Courtney Love. Courtney Love thought, I want to be in Liverpool. I want to be in the same city as Julian Cope and Echo and the Bunnymen. So, you know, you know, as I said, a lot of her experience actually does live up to that expectation, but there's a kind of change in the chemistry in her head. Like I say, Paris doesn't change. It's kind of something that happens inside there. She uses the phrase to her mother that in Paris she has room to live. Maybe that's another key phrase.
Yeah, that's lovely. It's interesting also because obviously Plath, although, you know, many feminists, yourself included, would always claim Plath for herself, but she's constantly associated with Ted Hughes. And in your book, she has quite a lot of encounters with men. She's either accompanied by men. So there's a point where she nearly sleeps with an old boyfriend, and then he decides that he's not sure. You also point out, which I always think of when people are wandering around the cities, that you can't wander everywhere as a young woman because you just get bothered. It can be really difficult, and she has those problems too, doesn't she?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the moments where, you know, I mean, if over the last half an hour I've been painting a picture that Sylvia had kind of undiluted bliss for her entire visits to Paris. Of course, that isn't the case. You know, I mean, she did oscillate anyway in her life between kind of despair and happiness, and you know that oscillation continued in Paris, and her encounters were not all positive. And being hassled by men in the street was something that really began to wear her down. There was one night where she decided to go and see a play, in fact, by Jean Anouilh, decided to go and see a play on her own. And she put on her best evening clothes, even though she was on her own. And she decided she looked très chic, which kind of really cheered her up. And she walked across Paris, set off to walk across Paris to the theatre, and immediately gets curb crawled by a man in a car who goes around the block a few times and hassles her. And that affects her for the whole of the evening. She still goes to the theatre, but comes back saying, you know, she didn't enjoy it because all that was still bothering her, as quite rightly, as it would. And she decides at that point not to go out again at night, which is one reason why she again links up with Giovanni, and because he kind of seems to understand what's going on in her life more than any of the others, and doesn't what you might say take advantage of the situation. And they kind of go and have dinner and talk about poetry. One night she just stays in a hotel room because she can't bear the hassle that she's getting.
Yeah, it's you know, it's sadly kind of still the case, really. It's a bit grim, but I'm very interested in the fact that she has all, you know, you describe it as a kind of sliding doors moment. Do you know what I mean? Like she had, perhaps she could have made up with this old boyfriend, but there are actually a few fellas, you know, around at that time. She'd slept with Ted Hughes the night before she left, and he's becoming bigger in her consciousness, but there are, you know, there's other men around. And I just wanted to tell you this. I don't know if you know it. I don't think you do, but so when I was retweeting your tweets about this evening, somebody got in contact with me on Twitter, and her name's Jen O'Neill, and I follow her. She's the editor of a woman's football magazine called Kick It Out, and her uncle, who now lives in New Zealand, insists that he lost his virginity to Sylvia Plath in Paris at that time. Wow. So there's another person. His name is Christian Martin, and I'm going to investigate.
No,
but he was.
You can write a sequel.
Yes, but he met her in a shop, and they ended up sleeping with each other.
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing about any Courtney Sylvia Plath link is that actually I think our received idea of Courtney is that she took a lot of lovers, but actually Plath, I think, probably took more. But I think that was the embracing irresponsibility side of Paris. She wasn't like that in Cambridge. In Cambridge, she was very concerned if the gossip got out that she was talking to a boy who she wasn't walking out with. But in Paris, other rules seem to apply. And I think that, like a lot of, educated, bookish young Americans of that era, women of that era, I think she felt very constricted and very constrained by the conventions, and was forever wishing upon herself. This is way before Paris, wishing upon herself the idea of living for the moment. Like probably a lot of us who read a lot, we kind of, might have a little bit of wariness about living for the moment. We kind of maybe hold back. Maybe writers generally are on the outside looking in and have that ability to step back from, the flux and the chaos and all that. Living for the moment means you're jumping into that. And there's a part of Sylvia from a very young age who was wishing that she was that kind of person. So after she meets Dimitri in the street, he's obviously propositioning her, and she goes home and writes in her journal, maybe I should have slept with him. Maybe I should have, tasted the moment.
But she goes in and out, doesn't she? Because you also mentioned there's a point where she writes a list of how she should behave. So it's a bit where she does basically think she's going to sleep with an ex-boyfriend called Tony, and he knocks her back. And then the next day she writes a long list of how she should be more chaste and subdued and perhaps take on the persona of a mystery woman. And that made me think also of Courtney Love, because the idea of mystique. Like maybe Courtney said that she learned the idea of mystique from all these amazing people in Liverpool at that time. Yeah. And Sylvia's trying to play with this idea of mystique. And weirdly, she has got an immense mystique now. But she was playing with that idea, wasn't she?
Yeah, I mean, and also actually playing with identities. The fact that even at that age, what would she have been, 23, Sylvia Plath was still writing notes to herself, suggesting that, yes, be more chaste, don't feel the need to talk all the time. So and I guess the part of the TED decision was to put an end to the uncertainty and unpredictability, plus put an end to her awareness that her mother wants her to settle down. Her mother wants two things which are incompatible. One, settle down and have children. Two, do your poetry and become a successful poet. And she again, in her letters to her mother, she's like, I don't know if I can do all these things at the same time.
Well, not perhaps in those days, and not if Ted isn't doing the childcare. We're going to move on quite soon. I just wanted to ask you one more question, which is just to do with something that you mentioned when you were introducing the book, and that's to do with Ted Hughes's reaction to their time in Paris, because obviously it's really important. This place is really important to Sylvia, and as you mentioned, the poem that Ted Hughes writes much
Mm.
later, called Your Paris, is quite nasty, isn't it? Really.
Well, I actually didn't know it existed until I was 3/4 of the way through writing the book, and then I reread Birthday Letters and realised that poem was in there, and it was about the time when, at the end of their honeymoon, when they were in Paris that I described earlier, and I decided that I wouldn't look at any critical writing online about the poem. And I would just treat it kind of not necessarily on face value, but I kind of do critique it, and obviously my critique is that, not obviously, but my critique is that it is quite nasty, and also it sets up. They stay that night at the Hotel de Continent. Those nights, the Hotel of Two Continents. And in the poem, he talks about how they were two continents. And at no point does he talk about our Paris. It's Your Paris was this, exuberant, exhilarated, full of art. My Paris was this, post-war, utilitarian. And he never talks about our Paris. He never talks about, you know, walking hand in hand through the streets, sitting outside a cafe bar with a coffee. And I don't, you know, but so it's all retrospective. And actually also in the poem, he mentions Richard's unopened letters. So he's also read the poem, having read all of Plath's journals after her death. So he's also at that point almost taking issue with the fact that she had a former lover and imagining that actually he was the one that she wanted to meet as they walked down the street. So it's kind of very, I was glad that I came to that poem having more or less written the book, because then I kind of felt like I really knew, you know, maybe it was slightly delusional, but I kind of felt like I knew what Paris meant to Sylvia at that point. So when he's saying, your Paris was this, I kind of felt very defensive on her behalf.
Yes, quite right, I'd say. So I think that we're now going to, are we going to have another reading?
Poem.
Another poem, fantastic.
Yeah.
And then we'll go to audience questions. I will mute myself.
Okay, so Vicky's going to read November Graveyard. Now, this was written in 1956. It was written at the end of 1956, when Plath first went to Yorkshire to meet the Hughes family, just after the marriage to Ted. And she was quite taken by the moors, you know, the wildness of it. And Ted Hughes took her around the area, and they went to the graveyard at Heptonstall Cemetery. And that caused her, or inspired her, to read November Graveyard. And of course, the irony, sad irony being that she would be buried in that graveyard less than 7 years later. So yes, Vicky, this is November Graveyard.
The scene stands stubborn. Skinflint trees hoard last leaves, won't mourn, wear sackcloth or turn elegiac dryads, and dour grass guards the hard-hearted emerald of its grassiness, however the grandiloquent mind may scorn such poverty. So, no dead men's cries flower forget-me-nots between the stone paving this grave ground. Here's honest rot to unpick the elaborate heart, pare bone free of the fictive vein. When one stark skeleton bulks real, all saints' tongues fall quiet. Flies watch no resurrections in the sun. At the essential landscape, stare. Stare till your eyes foist a vision dazzling on the wind. Whatever lost ghosts flare, damned, howling in their shrouds across the moor, rave on the leash of the starving mind which peoples the bare room, the blank, untenanted air.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Vicky. Okay, so Miranda, have you been able to access?
I can do the Q&A for you. I have some lovely questions here from everybody. Thanks for putting them up. Okay, I am going to take this one first from Grace. She says, hi Dave, I'm currently in year 13 and I'm writing a play for school inspired by the works and life of Plath. Do you have any advice or recommendations that would help make sure I'm capturing her true character? I feel as though she was constantly trying to reinvent herself. And she says she can't wait to read the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? I kind of think of, you know, we want people to be, I mean, we feel ourselves that we're 3 or 4 dimensional people, and yet we perceive other people in a 1 or at best 2 dimensional way. And I'm very guilty of that. You know, there's people that I know in my social circle, you know, I kind of know that I really don't know anything about them. I don't know them in any kind of a 3-dimensional way. And I think people who we don't know and people who we encounter through, art or politics or public life, we very rarely get beyond the one dimension, don't we? But I do feel that Sylvia Plath has been through different versions already. If you go to the biographies that have been written of her, then the first couple, including one by Anne Stevenson, was what you might call a taking sides biography. And it did paint Sylvia as a kind of neurotic person who was dangerous and hopeless at life, and who, had every reason to blame herself for what happened in her marriage. And those of you who know that biography will also know that it was written with the stern hand of Ted Hughes' sister standing behind Anne Stevenson. But since then, there have been biographies that I think have been more inclined to try and at least build a second dimension to Plath. I mean, the diaries, and the other thing is that there was what you say about reinventing. There is not just about reinventing, but also Plath had personas. And for just a few little examples, the letters that she wrote to her mother, which were one of the first things that was published in terms of her, journals and diaries, her letters to her mother, letters home, there was a selection. So first of all, it was skewed because it wasn't the complete letters to her mother. But the letters to her mother, as I explain, in fact, in the book, I think she tries to please her mother. She gives a very different idea of what's going on in her life than she does to her journals. So there's already a kind of, as you start working your way through all these books, you're already weighing things up. And then there's the poems. So you have the journals and the letters and the poems, and they don't all make a very easy match. So in terms of writing about Plath, I think the first thing you have to do is kind of accept that in a way. And if I can just say one more thing, which I don't want to give too long an answer, but in my approach to the books in this series, I feel like I try and access my own emotional life. I'm not not that interested in writing an academic objective book about these characters. One reason being there's lots of great objective books about these characters. You can read their biographies, it's endless. So I kind of feel like to give some emotional weight to the book, to access the deep stuff in their life, I need to access the deep stuff in my life. So I don't know if that's good advice to a young writer, but I don't think there's any reason why you can't take some control of the narrative and Plath become the person that you want her to be.
Well, exactly, you're in control. It's your play. Okay, I have a question here from Jenny. And she says, did you get a sense from Sylvia's journals about her seemingly quick decision to forge a relationship with Ted and marry within 10 weeks? And in your view, was this accelerated by her trip to Paris?
It's kind of, obviously it's kind of a whirlwind, isn't it? I do feel like she was feeling under pressure to settle down, and it was partly the pressure of, that young women of that era. I talk in the book, I actually quote one of her contemporaries at Smith College who says, in that era, the pressure was to be a good girl, and a good girl was a married girl. And, if you could procreate, then even better. And that pressure was there. Again, to her mother also put her under that kind of pressure. Was always asking, and Plath was always giving, slightly obscure bits of information about various men who she was dating. And the thing about the Ted thing, though, which I don't know, is I don't know how other people feel about this, is that I think Plath went into that relationship with her eyes open. I think she knew Ted was dangerous. I think that she knew Ted was a kind of no-nonsense, northern, unemotional, misogynistic, self-absorbed man. She knew that. It's in the poems that she wrote at the time. It's in the journals. It's in the letters that she wrote to her confidants. So why is the kind of the answer, the question, you know. But there was other things that Ted was giving her. You know, she was looking for the colossus. She was looking for the big male father figure, I guess, to make it probably too simplistic. You know, she was looking for a protector, but she was also looking for a marauder. You know, she writes poems about the marauder. So she has these two kinds of ideal man, a protector and a marauder. And who am I to say whether those are ideal types or not? But actually, Ted seemed to fulfill that for her. But that idea that, yeah, she, and I think being in Paris accelerated it, because she had lost Richard. So I think the main other option in her life, I think she realized had gone. I mean, Richard did take a very important part, I think, in her emotional and, dare I say, sexual development, and almost on a kind of D.H. Lawrence type way. But once he'd gone, I think the others paled, which is a word that she uses actually about putting men down, you know, the pale Cambridge types. I think they literally paled into insignificance, let alone the kind of the men back home in America who were, you know, again, she calls one kind of, you know, the staple, yeah, the kind of the staple diet. Yeah, so she did literally in that, more or less in that list that Miranda was talking about of that she wrote on her final weekend, of how she wanted things to be in the future, you know, commit to Ted was on that list.
Yeah. I have a question here from, I think, Vicky, and it is, what band do you think Sylvia would play today? I'd quite like to know, what band do you think Sylvia would play in today? But that's me.
Wow. Well, Sylvia, bless her, she's so un-rock and roll. I mean, she's actually more or less the same age as my dad, okay? And my dad and my mum, who's no longer with us, they were, I always feel like, the last generation before rock and roll. Like my parents in 1963, as the Beatles, you know, were everywhere, exploding, and swinging 60s were about to be unleashed. My parents had 3 children under the age of 4, so they weren't going to be part of the swinging 60s. And, you know, so Sylvia Plath was a similar age. You know, she, I mean, this is something that she didn't have in common with James Baldwin. She wasn't really even, you know, she wasn't into bebop or anything. In fact, at the party where she meets Ted in Cambridge, she complains how loud the jazz band are in one room. So I'm not really sure, given all that, although she could mambo, her mother gave her some dance lessons.
Perhaps you could just play the maracas.
So maybe she could be, no, she could play the maracas. She maybe play the maracas and go on tour with PJ Harvey. I think she would definitely like PJ Harvey. I really feel like, I think her and Keith Haring could have gone to see Patti Smith together. That would have been good. I think her and Courtney would have probably clashed a little. But and then of course there is Joy Division, I guess, you know. So yeah, I
there's a few. we could make her some kind of, you know, mixtape.
Yeah, I feel like I should do a Spotify Sylvia Plath playlist
That sounds great.
Which is, yeah. I mean, actually writing the book, I was obviously writing the book during the pandemic, and I'd written a lot of it up to the end of February, and I thought I was going to scoot straight through it. And then when the pandemic hit and lockdown began, I kind of really wobbled in lots of different ways, as I think a lot of people did. And there were people online saying, I'm going to learn to bake cakes and I'm going to write a novel. And, that soon ended, didn't it? Because especially the writing bit, because my head was so frazzled. And I think it took until about June for me to really properly get back to Plath and the book, by which time the deadline was looming. And the way that I got back to it was I began listening to a lot of music that I had in my mind that I felt connected to Paris in 1956. So Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, that kind of soundtrack to early Nouvelle Vague. And I was playing it constantly, so that I was thinking, if I was going to be in Paris in 1956 and I would be there in person to actually, be interviewing Sylvia Plath about these experiences, then this would be the music that would be playing. And so I kind of felt like, the second half of the lockdown, I actually ended up being in Paris with Sylvia Plath listening to bebop. And that was so much better than being stuck in the house with nowhere to go. But also, actually being in the pandemic, I don't know how other people have felt, but my nerves and my emotions have been so frazzled. I feel like it actually helped me understand Plath a little bit more. I know that might sound a bit presumptuous, but just as I was saying before about accessing the deep stuff, I think we've all accessed the deep stuff over the last few months. So, being deep with Sylvia, is something that I actually, by the time I got my head round it and I was playing the bebop, I was able to do.
That sounds good. Okay, so look, Polly List just says, please do a Plath playlist. You're going to have to do it now. Okay, I've got time, I think, for one more question, which is from Kerry. Did Sylvia write about having any favourite French writers or artists?
Yes, she, Paul Verlaine, the poet, she really liked. But unbeknownst to her, I discovered that the first hotel she stayed in when she went over to be with Richard at Christmas was actually a hotel that Verlaine lived in for a while. But obviously Sylvia Plath, not having access to Google, had no way of finding that out. And there's a part in her diary near the end of her Easter visit where she loves her hotel room in Paris. It's only cheap. She pays a bit extra for croissant and, as she calls it, milky coffee. And she loves the view of the rooftops from her attic window. And she decides one day just to lie there on her yellow bedspread in her attic room, and she listens to the rain falling, and she quotes Paul Verlaine saying, the rain falls on the city as it falls in my heart.
That's lovely, thank you. Okay, I'm going to end the Q&A section, but I'd just like to say thanks to everybody who asked questions, because they're really lovely questions. I really appreciate it. I'm handing back to you now, Dave. Okay, thank you, Miranda. I'm going to, if you do stick around, I'm going to give you even more profuse thanks at the very end. Okay, fab. Event. Okay, well, so Vicky's going to read Lady Lazarus. Okay, Lady Lazarus, that's in this aerial collection. It's one of several poems that you will know, no doubt, Plath fans, written in the autumn of 1962. That summer, obviously, the marriage with Ted Hughes had collapsed, and Plath had that incredible burst of anger, insight, despair, creativity, incredible in that autumn, and she wrote Lady Lazarus. Now,
Vicky and I found online Plath reading Lady Lazarus, and we found Plath reading lots of poetry. Sylvia Plath's poetic voice is quite unsettling if you go online and listen to her voice. First of all, obviously it's American. It's kind of bourgeois Boston. It has almost no warmth to it at all. It's very unsettling, quite sharp-edged. And I don't think she would have read Mad Girl's Love Song as well as Vicky. I know that sounds odd, but you know, not all poets can read their poems well. But I do feel like that voice reading Lady Lazarus has a lot of impact. And I almost can't imagine Lady Lazarus without hearing the voice of Sylvia Plath. So Vicky has taken up the challenge of impersonating, if you like, or getting close to the voice of Sylvia Plath. So she's going to read Lady Lazarus in the style of Sylvia Plath, which is, you know, as I say, we've been exchanging Plath online, YouTube, etc. And I mean, I had not heard Vicky do this, but it's going to be in the style of Sylvia Plath. Not only because I think the poem is a fitting, the voice is a good fit to the poem, but also I felt that if we read the final poem in the style of Sylvia Plath, we would be closer to her. Vicky.
I have done it again. 1 year in every 10, I manage it. A sort of walking miracle, my skin bright as a Nazi lampshade, my right foot a paperweight, my face a featureless fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin, oh my enemy. Do I terrify? Yes, yes, Herr Professor, it is I. Can you deny the nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth? The sour breath will vanish in a day. Soon, soon the flesh the grave cave ate will be at home on me, and I a smiling woman. I'm only 30, and like the cat, I have 9 times to die. This is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments. The peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see them unwrap me hand and foot. The big striptease. Gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bone. I may be Japanese. Nevertheless, I am the same identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. The second time, I meant to last it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut as a seashell. They had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I've a call. It's easy enough to do it in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical comeback in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute, amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. There is a charge for the eyeing of my scars. There is a charge for the hearing of my heart. It really goes. And there is a charge, a very large charge for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So, Herr Doctor. So, Herr Enemy. I am your opus. I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts to a streak. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir. Flesh, bone, there is nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Herr God, Herr Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air.
So that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Vicky. Incredible reading, and all three poems, incredible readings. Thank you so much to Miranda and to Vicky. Thank you also to Girl Gang Manchester, represented by Megan, who helped organise this event. And thank you most of all to you all for attending. Of course, just a final hard sell on the book. It is available from Confingo Publishing. And it's a very reasonable price, I am sure. It's a very wonderful cover, and I've had a really brilliant evening. Thank you all.